No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being closely watched by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. With a great feeling of security, men went about their daily business, sure of their own earthly empire. No one even gave a thought to the possibility of life on other planets. Yet, across the gulf of space, minds vast and cool and unsympathetic regarded this Earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. The storm burst upon us 6 years ago. Astronomers in England noted a huge outbreak of incandescent gas on Mars. It seemed to be a mass of flaming gas, chiefly hydrogen, moving with great speed toward Earth. This jet of fire was compared to a colossal puff of flame suddenly and violently bursting out of the planet Mars. Yet the next day, there was nothing of this in the papers except a little note in the Daily Telegraph, and the world went on in ignorance of one of the gravest dangers that ever threatened the human race. I might not have heard of the eruption at all had I not met Ogilvy, the well-known astronomer in the observatory at Ottershaw. He was very excited at the news and invited me to take a look at Mars with him through his telescope. It seemed such a small planet when viewed from the Earth, so bright and still and faintly marked with stripes. It seemed only a pin's head of light, and all around it was the mysterious darkness of outer space. But invisible to me that night, because it was so remote and small, flying swiftly toward me across that incredible distance, came the thing they were sending to Earth. The thing that was to bring so much destruction and death to man. I never dreamed of it that night. No one on Earth dreamed of that unseen missile. That night, too, there was another jetting out of flaming gas from the distant planet. I saw it just as the clock in the observatory struck midnight. Ogilvy saw it too, and exclaimed at the streamer of gas that came out of the vastness of space towards us. And so, another invisible missile started on its way to Earth from Mars, just 24 hours after the first one had been sent. Down below in the darkness were the towns of Ottershaw and Woking, with all their hundreds of people sleeping in peace. Hundreds of observers saw the strange jet of flaming gas that night, and the next night about midnight, and again the night after. And so, for 10 nights, a jet of flaming gas shot out from Mars. Why the shot stopped after the 10th night, no one on Earth knows. Even the daily papers woke up to the disturbances at last. Those missiles the Martians had fired at us drew earthward, rushing now at a speed of many miles a second through the empty gulf of space, nearer and nearer. It seems to me now almost incredibly wonderful that with this strange fate hanging over us, men could go about their daily concerns as calmly as they did. Then came the night of the first falling star. Many people saw it early in the morning, rushing eastward over the city of Winchester, a line of flame high in the sky. Hundreds must have seen it and taken it for an ordinary falling star. Very early in the morning, Ogilvy, who had seen the shooting star, went out to find the place where it had fallen. He soon came upon it in a field outside the town of Woking, near some sand pits. An enormous hole had been made by the impact of the missile, and the sand and gravel had been flung violently in every direction over the field, forming heaps visible a mile and a half away. The heather was on fire, and a thin blue smoke rose in the dawn. The thing itself lay almost entirely buried in sand, The uncovered part had the appearance of a huge cylinder caked over with a thick, scaly crust. It had a diameter of about 30 yards. Ogilvy approached it, surprised at its size and shape. It was, however, still so hot from its flight through the air that Ogilvy could not get very close to it. A stirring noise within the cylinder he attributed to the unequal cooling of its surface, for at that time it had not occurred to him that the missile might be hollow. Then suddenly, he noticed that some of the gray crust that covered the missile was falling away. It was dropping off in flakes, and a large piece suddenly came off and fell with a sharp noise that alarmed him. And then he observed that very slowly, the circular top of the cylinder was rotating on its body, and the end jerked forward an inch or two. Suddenly it dawned on him that the cylinder was artificial, hollow, with an end that screwed out, and something inside the cylinder was unscrewing the top. His first thought was that there was someone inside, half roasted to death, trying to escape, and at once he linked this thing with the flashes he had observed upon Mars. He ran to get help and came upon Henderson, the London journalist covering the story, but neither of them was able to open the cylinder. The story of this strange missile broke in that day's newspapers, and soon a small crowd had gathered in the field to see what was going on. It was then that I heard of the unexplained landing and lost no time in going out to the sand pits. At the edge of the pit made by the cylinder, I found half a dozen men, including Ogilvy. A large portion of the cylinder had been uncovered, though its lower end was still embedded. The curious crowd had grown much larger, and soon 200 or 300 people clustered around the pit. The end of the cylinder was certainly being unscrewed from the inside. I think everyone expected to see a man emerge, possibly something a little unlike earthly man, but in all essentials a man. I know I did, but looking closely, I saw something stirring within the shadow, grayish, billowy movements, one above another, and then 2 luminous discs like eyes. Then something, a little gray snake, coiled up and wriggled in the air towards me, and then came another. A sudden chill went through me. The frightened crowd drew back. More snake-like tentacles were now projecting from the cylinder. I saw astonishment giving place to horror on the faces of the people around me. A big, grayish, rounded bulk about the size of a bear was rising slowly and painfully out of the cylinder. As it bulged up and caught the light, it glistened like wet leather. 2 large, dark-colored eyes looked steadily at me. The mass that framed them, the head of the thing, was rounded and had a peculiar face. There was a mouth under the eyes, the lipless brim of which quivered and panted and dripped saliva. The whole creature heaved and pulsated convulsively. A slim tentacle gripped the edge of the cylinder. Another swayed in the air. Those who have never seen a living Martian can hardly imagine the strange horror of its appearance. The peculiar V-shaped mouth, the absence of eyebrow ridges, the absence of a chin, the endless quivering of the mouth and the snake-like tentacles, all inspired terror. The creature evidently found it painful to move due to the greater gravitational pull on Earth. But above all was the extraordinary intensity of the immense and monstrous eyes. Suddenly, the monster vanished. It had toppled over the brim of the cylinder and fallen into the pit with a thud like the fall of a great mass of leather. I heard it give a peculiar, thick cry, and then another of these creatures appeared in the deep shadow within the cylinder. I turned and ran toward a group of trees about 100 yards away. A kind of awful fascination paralyzed my actions. I was drawn to the pit, yet afraid to leave the safety of the trees. Finally, I moved cautiously, curiously, toward the pit. Suddenly, there was a flash of light, and a luminous greenish smoke came out of the pit in 3 distinct puffs, which rose straight up into the still air. This smoke was so bright that the deep blue sky overhead and the hazy stretches of brown field seemed to darken suddenly. At the same time, a faint hissing sound could be heard. Then slowly the hissing turned into a long, loud, droning noise. Slowly, a humped shape rose out of the pit, and the ghost of a beam of light seemed to flicker. Then, flashes of actual flame began to spring from one person to another among the onlookers. It was as if some invisible jet of fire had touched them and flashed into white flame. Each man seemed suddenly turned to fire. Then, by the light of their own destruction, I saw them staggering and falling while their nearest neighbors ran away. I stood staring, not as yet realizing that this was death, leaping from man to man in that crowd. It was a blinding flash of light, and each man fell headlong and lay still. Then the shaft of heat passed over them to the nearby pine trees, which burst into flame. It was sweeping around swiftly and steadily, this flaming death, this invisible sword of heat. I saw it coming by the flaming bushes it touched. I thought with horror that the Martians must possess some extraordinary type of heat ray. I turned and ran away across the smoldering field that was suddenly dark and empty. That night, 40 people lay under the starlight around the pit, charred and distorted beyond recognition. And yet, few people in the town of Woking even knew that the cylinder had opened. Few realized that sticking into the skin of our planet Earth like a poisoned dart was this cylinder. Around it was a patch of silent field, with a few dark, dimly seen objects lying in contorted positions. Here and there was a burning bush or tree. But in the rest of the world, the stream of life still flowed as it had flowed for endless years, unaware of this strange and sudden invasion. The next day lives in my memory as a day of suspense. The Martians did not show an inch of themselves. They seemed busy in their pit, and there was a sound of hammering and an almost continuous streamer of smoke. Apparently, they were busy getting ready for a struggle. About 6 p.m. at home, I heard a muffled explosion from the distant field. Close on the heels of that came a violent, rattling crash quite close to my house. I ran out on the lawn and saw the tops of the trees around a nearby college burst into smoky red flames and the tower of a little church slide down into ruin. I realized that my home and, in fact, the entire town of Woking must now be within range of the Martians' devastating heat ray. I had begun running from the house when I saw a lurid green glare light up the road about me. I saw that the clouds had been pierced by a thread of green fire that was falling into the field to my left. It was another falling missile. I kept on going, and abruptly my attention was arrested by something that was moving rapidly down the opposite slope of the nearby hill. Soon, this object came into view, clear and sharp and bright. And this thing I saw, how can I describe it? A monstrous tripod higher than many houses, standing over the young pine trees and smashing them aside. A walking engine of glittering metal striding now across the heather. Living ropes of steel dangling from it. Its clattering tumult mingling with the thunder of storm clouds overhead. Then a second huge tripod appeared, rushing headlong toward me. At the sight of the second monster, my nerve completely disappeared. I crouched on the ground And in another moment, the colossal mechanism went striding by me and passed uphill. Seeing nearer, the thing was incredibly strange, for it was no mere non-living machine driving on its way. Yet, it was a machine with a ringing metallic pace and long, flexible, glittering tentacles swinging and rattling about its strange body. It went striding along the road, and the brazen hood that surmounted it moved back and forth like a head. Behind the main body was a huge mass of white metal, and puffs of green smoke squirted out from the joints of the limbs as the monster swept by me, and in an instant, it was gone. As it passed, it set up a deafening howl that drowned out the thunder, and in another minute, it was with its companion half a mile away, stooping over something in the field. I have no doubt this thing in the field was one of the 10 cylinders they were firing at us from Mars. Shaken but unharmed, I returned home to see what new damage had been done. It seemed as if the whole region was on fire. I could see the gigantic Martian shapes in the distance. I could not know what they were doing, but they seemed amazingly busy. Yet I still did not know the relation between these mechanical giants and the sluggish lumps that I had first seen emerging from the cylinder. At this point, a soldier came up to the house to find a place to hide. He had been a member of an artillery unit sent out to fight the invaders. He told me of his regiment's hopeless battle with the Martians. In a tense whisper, he told how a gun had exploded behind him in the field. Ammunition blew up, and there was fire all around him. He said he found himself lying under a heap of charred men and dead horses. He lay there very still, surrounded by a smell that reminded him of burnt meat. His regiment, he said, had been swept out of existence. Then, one of the monstrous Martian machines walked leisurely across the field among the few fugitives, with its head-like hood turning around exactly like the head of a hooded human being. A kind of arm carried a complicated metallic case which projected the deadly heat ray. After pulverizing his regiment, the giant destroyed the railway station and a cluster of houses with a single sting of his heat ray. Then the thing shut off the heat ray and started away. As it did so, a second glittering monster appeared from the pit. He told me his story fearfully, and we lit no lamp for fear of attracting the Martians. His story had so shaken me that I decided to leave the area immediately. But apparently, many others had also heard tales of the Martians' destructive power. I found myself among hundreds of people waiting to be ferried across a river to safety, when suddenly there was a rush of smoke far up the river. Quickly, one after the other, 5 of the armored Martians appeared. They were striding rapidly towards us. Their metallic bodies glittered in the sun and grew rapidly larger as they came nearer. At the sight of these strange, swift, and terrible creatures, the crowd near the water's edge seemed horror-struck. The terrible heat rays struck a nearby town, and we could hear the flames crackling in the distance. My only thought was to get under water and so escape the reach of the heat ray. I plunged under the surface of the water, as did many people. One of the Martian machines approached, and suddenly a shell from a nearby artillery unit burst upon the Martian. It wiped off the face of the thing. The hood bulged, flashed, and was torn off in a dozen tattered fragments of red and glittering metal. The headless giant reeled back and forth. A violent explosion shook the air as the machine collapsed into the river. The water immediately flashed into steam as the generator of the heat ray hit the river's surface. In another moment, a huge, scaldingly hot wave came sweeping around the bend of the river. I saw people screaming and shouting faintly above the roar of the Martian's collapse. Thick clouds of steam were pouring off the wreckage. The tentacles swayed and struck like living arms. It was as if some wounded thing were struggling for its life amid the waves. My attention was diverted from this death struggle by a furious screaming which sounded something like a siren. Looking back, I saw the other Martians advancing with gigantic strides down the river bank. The water was growing hotter and hotter around me. The steam from the water was rising in a whirling white fog that at first completely hid the Martians. Then I saw them dimly. Colossal figures of gray, magnified by the mist. They had passed by me, and two were stooping over the frothing ruins of their comrade. A third and fourth stood beside him in the water. The generators of the heat rays waved high, and the hissing beams struck everything in sight. The air was full of sound, a deafening and confusing conflict of noises. The clangorous din of the Martians, the crash of falling houses, the thud of trees, fences and sheds flashing into flame, and the crackling and roaring of fire. For a moment I stood there in the almost boiling water, feeling that escape was hopeless. Then suddenly the white flashes of the heat ray came leaping toward me. In another moment, a huge wave, nearly at the boiling point, rushed upon me. I screamed aloud and scalded, half-blinded and agonized. I staggered through the leaping, hissing water towards the shore. By a miracle, I escaped unseen by the Martians. The Martians then retreated to their original position in the field. Cylinder followed cylinder on its interplanetary flight. Every 24 hours brought additional reinforcements. Meanwhile, the military and naval authorities of England, now fully aware of the tremendous power of their enemy, worked with furious energy. Authorities hoped that any further cylinders that fell could be destroyed at once by high explosives. Elaborate measures were being taken for the protection of the people in the threatened suburbs of London. In that great city, a clanging of bells, distant drumming, and the sound of people fleeing in the streets announced the coming danger. For the Martians had resumed the offensive with a new and insidious weapon. Advancing in a line toward London, each of the Martians threw a huge canister over whatever hill, cluster of homes, or other possible cover for guns lay in front of him. These canisters smashed upon striking the ground and released an enormous volume of heavy, inky vapor, coiling and pouring upward in a huge black cloud that spread itself slowly over the surrounding country. And the touch of that vapor, the inhaling of it, was death to anything that breathed. These spreading coils of vapor advanced rapidly. Men near it shrieked and fell, choking and writhing on the ground. There was sudden extinction. Nothing but a silent mass of impenetrable vapor hiding its dead. The citizens of London at last realized the necessity of flight. It was a roaring wave of fear that swept through the city just as Monday was dawning. The stream of flight rose swiftly to a torrent. Had the Martians aimed only at destruction, they might on Monday have annihilated the entire population of London as it fled the city. But the glittering Martians did not seem to have aimed at extermination. They exploded any stores of ammunition they came upon, cut every telegraph, and wrecked most of the railways, but they did not come beyond the central part of London all that day. And meanwhile, the cylinders kept falling to earth. As for myself, I had fled from the heat ray and from the mysterious inky vapor. During my search for safety, I met up with a frightened young man who joined me in my travels. We soon found an empty house and hid there in the darkness. To our horror, one of the Martian fighting machines approached, and 4 or 5 men accidentally ran across its path. Our amazement was great when we saw the Martian pick them up one by one. Apparently, he tossed them into a metallic carrier which projected behind him. My companion and I sat in the kitchen, not daring to strike a match for fear of attracting any Martians. Then suddenly came a blinding glare of vivid green light. A huge explosion followed, which seemed to be right on top of us. Glass crashed, masonry crumbled, and the plaster ceiling came down upon our heads. We sat for a long time, very quietly, trying to figure out what our situation could possibly be at this point. As the dawn grew clearer, we saw through a gap in the wall the body of a Martian standing guard over a still, glowing cylinder. Quickly, the danger of our situation dawned upon me. A cylinder from Mars had struck the house and buried us under its ruins. We remained very quiet and scarcely breathed. Outside, there began a metallic hammering, a violent hooting, and then a hissing, like the hissing of an engine. Our kitchen stood buried under soil and ruins, closed in by tons of earth on every side, except the side facing the cylinder. Cautiously, looking out a crack in the wall, we saw that the cylinder was already opened in the center of the pit, and on the farther edge of the pit, one of the great fighting machines stood stiff and tall against the evening sky. I saw an extraordinary, glittering mechanism busy in the excavation of the pit. The mechanism was one of those complicated affairs that have since been called handling machines. It seemed to be sort of a metallic crab-like creature with 5 jointed, agile legs, and with an amazing number of jointed levers, bars, and reaching and clutching tentacles about its body. Most of its arms were retracted, but with 3 long tentacles, it was fishing out a number of rods, plates, and bars which lined and apparently strengthened the walls of the cylinder. Its motion was so swift and complex and perfect that it did not seem to be a machine. It was at this moment that I realized the true nature of both the monstrous fighting machines and these crab-like mechanisms. Controlling the movements of each was a Martian, one of those leathery, sprawling bodies that I had seen when the first cylinder opened. By artificial metallic additions to their bodies, they became vastly superior to man. They were mere brains, wearing different bodies according to their needs. When I later thought about this ability of the Martians, I found it easy to believe that they might have descended from creatures not unlike ourselves, but they gradually developed the brain and hands or tentacles at the expense of the rest of the body. I also later found out another point about their physical makeup. Microorganisms, which cause so much disease and pain on Earth, have either never appeared on Mars, or Martian sanitary science eliminated them ages ago. 100 diseases, all the contagions of human life, never entered their lives. But at the present moment, I had no time for reflections such as these. My friend and I were doing all we could just to keep silent and avoid the large and all-seeing eyes of the Martians. Many days passed in this way, but as time wore on, my companion seemed to be going slightly mad and was constantly whining and complaining about our hopeless position. In an extremely annoying manner, he insisted that we were caught up in the end of the world and that death would surely be our reward. I tried my best to ignore his ramblings, but soon his voice grew louder and louder, and I became alarmed that he would be heard. I tried desperately to silence him, but he would not listen. Finally, I reached out with the meat chopper which hung on the wall and struck him with its butt end. He lay stretched out on the floor. Suddenly, I heard a noise outside, and as I looked up, I saw the crab-like machine coming toward the house. One of its gripping limbs curled among the debris. Another limb appeared, feeling its way over the fallen beams. I stood petrified, staring. I saw the large, dark eyes of the Martian peering, and then a long, metallic snake of a tentacle came feeling slowly into the house. I turned and stumbled over my friend's unconscious body. The tentacle was now some way into the room and was twisting and turning with queer, sudden movements. I trembled violently. Had the Martian seen me? I crept into the partially demolished coal cellar, shut the door, and began to cover myself up as much as I could among the firewood and coal. Then, huddled there silently, hardly breathing, I heard the tentacle feeling over the kitchen floor. Then I heard it nearer. It had found the door. In the darkness, I could just see the thing, like an elephant's trunk, waving towards me and touching, examining the entire room. Once even, it touched the heel of my boot. I was on the verge of screaming. I bit my hand. For a time, the tentacle was still. I shifted my position and listened. Then it left. I lay all that day in the darkness, buried in the coal. It was not until the next day that I felt it was safe enough for me to leave my hiding place. Even then, it was several days before I finally gathered up enough courage to look outside and see what the Martians were doing. I could hardly believe my eyes. There was nothing in the pit. The Martians were gone. My chance for escape had come, and I scrambled out of the house in which I had been buried so long. My chief impulse was hunger, and I foraged around the area for food. The whole surrounding region had been wrecked. I saw no human beings and no Martians. For a time, I believed that mankind had been swept out of existence and that I was the last man alive. The Martians, I thought, had gone on and left the country desolated, seeking food elsewhere. But the morning was bright and fine, and I walked trying to escape the scene of Martian destruction. Presently, I turned with an odd feeling of being watched and saw something crouching amid a clump of bushes. Soon it arose and took the form of a man. He stood motionless, looking at me. After some small conversation, I was amazed to realize that he was the soldier who had come to my house the day after the first cylinder opened. He told me that the Martians had left the city of London. Then he expressed his belief that man was beaten. It was his idea that the Martians had not come to wage war on Earth for the purpose of destruction, but to catch and preserve specimens of man for their own purposes. In a hushed voice, he spoke of a time when men would live in Martian cages and serve as food, pets, and hunters for their Martian masters. I found his reasoning almost believable, and then he laid out his plan for survival of the strongest who would escape domination by the Martians. His plan was to invent a sort of life where men could live and breed underground, safe from Martian interference. He proposed the drains of London as a suitable living area, and his idea was so convincing that we actually began digging that day down and down into the main drain of the area where we had met. But soon, I found myself growing tired of his elaborate plans for survival, and even felt a twinge of guilt about deserting the rest of mankind in this way. I felt a great urge to go into London. There I thought I had the best chance of learning what the Martians were doing, and so I left the soldier and walked on into London. The further I penetrated into that city, the more profound grew the stillness. I began wondering why I had come to this city of the dead. No people filled the streets, and desolation spread silently everywhere. Then I came upon a wrecked Martian machine. I wondered what had happened, and climbed amid the wreckage. A pack of wild dogs was busy devouring the remains of one of the controlling Martians. Then I saw another motionless Martian machine, and soon a dozen of them, stark and silent, sprang into view. I could not understand how they had been so suddenly and mysteriously killed. It was only much later that I found the cause. They were slain by microscopic enemies, the disease bacteria against which their systems were unprepared. It seemed almost laughable. Our guns and ammunition could not stop their advance, but man's microscopic allies had begun to work for their death as soon as the first cylinder opened. There were nearly 50 of the Martians scattered around London, overtaken by a death that must have seemed incomprehensible to them. And as I walked through the streets, I realized that the city was not completely destroyed, though all was silent and abandoned. I felt sure that survivors would soon begin to return. The pulse of life would once again beat. Now that it was all over, the question of most universal interest is the possibility of another attack from Mars. Much more thought should be given to this problem. But if there were a next time, the first Martian cylinder might be destroyed with dynamite before the Martians even emerged. I think our enemies have lost a vast advantage in the failure of their first surprise attack. Possibly they see it in the same light. But the most important outcome of the invasion is that we have now learned that we cannot regard this planet Earth as being fenced in and secure. We are subject to attack. And if there is a next time, we will be ready.